Week 3. The third week at sea began with an eerie calm. After the violence of the previous storm, the Atlantic had become strangely peaceful. The sails hung lazily in the light breeze, and the ship no longer groaned and lurched as though it were fighting for its life. For the passengers, however, the calm brought problems of its own. The wind that filled the sails also carried away the stale air below deck. Now there was barely enough of either. The emigrant hold became hotter with each passing day. Moisture collected on the heavy beams overhead before dripping steadily back onto the passengers below. Blankets that had been damp since leaving Ireland never truly dried, and the smell that had haunted the lower deck since the first week became almost impossible to ignore. Even those who had grown accustomed to it sometimes climbed onto the open deck simply to breathe. Michael was one of them. Looking across the motionless ocean, he wondered if this endless blue world might never end. There was no land, no fishing boats, no passing ships, just an empty horizon that seemed to mock every promise America had ever made. Behind him, the ship's carpenter hammered fresh wedges into seams that had opened during the storm. Each vessel leaked to some degree, and several times each day sailors manned the pumps to remove the seawater that found its way into the bilges. "She's old," one sailor muttered to Michael, "but she'll get us there." Michael hoped the man believed his own words. Food had become increasingly monotonous. Every breakfast seemed identical to the last: oatmeal, hard biscuit, occasionally a little salted pork or beef, sometimes dried peas if the cook had enough fresh water to soften them. Fresh vegetables had disappeared days ago. A few onions and potatoes brought aboard before departure had either spoiled or been consumed during the first fortnight. Mary worried constantly about little Mary Jr. The child still smiled and laughed, but her clothes seemed looser with each passing week. Her cheeks had lost some of their fullness. Even Brandon, normally bursting with energy, no longer chased Sean around the deck whenever the weather allowed. Children adapted to hunger in curious ways. Instead of complaining, they simply became quieter. One afternoon, Mary noticed Sean scratching the back of his neck. At first she thought little of it. Children often scratched at insect bites, and then she looked more closely. Tiny insects crawled through the seams of his shirt, lice. Within hours she discovered them in Brandon's hair as well. She spent the evening carefully combing through Boy's hair with a small bone comb she had packed back in County Kerry. The task seemed endless. By morning they had returned. The overcrowded conditions made infestation almost unavoidable. Families slept shoulder to shoulder, blankets were shared, children played together. Every cough, every embrace, every borrowed shawl brought people into close contact. Lice spread with remarkable speed. The passengers hated them, but few realized they could carry disease. Many simply accepted them as another misery of the voyage. The ship's surgeon had become busier. Each morning a queue formed outside his tiny cabin. Some complained of fevers, others of stomach pains. Persistent diarrhea had weakened several elderly passengers until they could barely stand. A young mother begged him to help her infant, whose cries had become weaker each day. The surgeon mixed a little laudanum with water to ease the child's distress. There was little else he could offer. Modern medicine would later understand that dehydration from diarrheal illnesses could be deadly, especially on children. On a crowded emigrant ship with limited supplies, replacing lost fluids was often impossible. Passengers knew only that some people became sick, and some never recovered. On Wednesday evening, the bell rang unexpectedly, not for danger, for prayer. Nearly every passenger gathered on the upper deck. The captain had granted them a half an hour before sunset. A grey-haired priest, travelling among the emigrants, stepped forward holding a weathered Bible whose leather cover had cracked with age. The Atlantic stretched endlessly behind him. He spoke without shouting. He didn't need to. The silence carried his words. "We have left our homes, but not our hope." Heads bowed throughout the crowd. Catholics crossed themselves. Some Protestants quietly offered prayers of their own. Others simply listened. Michael wasn't certain what he believed anymore. He had prayed for the potato crop. He had prayed while neighbours starved. He had prayed as his own brother was buried in frozen ground. Sometimes it seemed heaven had answered these with silence. Yet here he stood, listening all the time. After the service, an elderly man from Cork quietly remarked to him, "Funny, isn't it?" "What is?" "We've all become much more religious since the food ran out." Michael managed a tired smile. Desperation had a way of sending even doubtful people searching for certainty. The week brought another tragedy. An elderly passenger named Mrs. O'Donovan, who had struggled with fever since the first week, died quietly in her sleep. The news spread throughout the hold before sunrise. No one spoke above a whisper. Death had been expected. Still, expecting it didn't make it easier. That afternoon the passengers gathered on deck. Her body had been carefully wrapped in canvas. A simple weight had been sewn into the fabric near her feet. There was no coffin. There could not be. The captain removed his hat. The priest read several passages from Scripture. Mary held Sean close as Brandon stared silently at the bundle lying upon the wooden planks. When the prayers ended, 2 sailors gently lifted the body. For a moment it rested against the rail, then, with quiet dignity, it slipped into the Atlantic. There was barely a splash. Within seconds the sea had swallowed every trace. Brandon tugged gently at his father's sleeve. Will her family ever know where she is? Michael looked over the endless water. I suppose they'll only know she's somewhere between Ireland and America. That thought remained with Brandon long after everyone had returned below. No grave, no headstone, no flowers. Only an ocean so vast that no map could ever mark the place where she disappeared. The following morning, life aboard the ship continued almost as though nothing had happened. Breakfast was served. The pumps were worked. The sails were trimmed. Children played. The surgeon made his rounds. The Atlantic cared little for human grief. It stretched onward, indifferent to every hope and every heartbreak carried across its surface. As the 3rd week drew to a close, Michael noticed something changing among the passengers. They no longer spoke constantly of America. Instead, they spoke of surviving tomorrow. The voyage itself had become their entire world. The ocean had erased calendars, distances, even certainty. There remained 9 long weeks before they would sight land again, and though no one dared to say it aloud, everyone now understood why people had begun calling these vessels coffin ships. Week 4. The 4th week began beneath a sky so blue it almost seemed cruel. The Atlantic rolled gently beneath the ship, the waves rising and falling in long, slow swells. To anyone watching from a distance, the vessel might have appeared to be on a pleasant summer voyage. Only those below the deck knew the truth. The hold had become a world unto itself. It smelt of damp timber, stale air, sweat, vomit, salt and sickness. The scent clung to clothing and hair so completely that even those who climbed onto the deck each morning carried it back with them. The passengers had stopped apologizing for the smell. There was simply no escaping it. Their clothes had not been properly washed since leaving Ireland. The little soap that families had brought with them had long since been used up. Fresh water remained too precious for anything except drinking and cooking. Faces had become thinner, beards longer, hair tangled. The ship had transformed respectable farming families into people who scarcely recognized themselves. Mary often caught sight of her reflection in a bucket of water before it was emptied overboard. The woman staring back looked 10 years older than the one who had stepped aboard only a month before. Little Mary Jr. had begun coughing during the previous week. At first it was no more than an occasional tickle in her throat. Children coughed. Everyone coughed. No one paid much attention. But by the 2nd day of the week, however, the cough had become deeper. It came in long fits that left her struggling to catch her breath. She no longer chased after Sean when he played. Instead, she lay quietly against her mother's shoulder, her forehead warm and her small body strangely heavy. Mary felt her daughter's brow. It burned beneath her hand. "Michael," she whispered, "I think she's taken ill." Michael reached over and touched the little girl's face. He withdrew his hand slowly. She was far hotter than he had expected. The ship's surgeon examined her that afternoon. He listened to her breathing, looked into her mouth, and gently lifted her eyelids. "How long has she had a fever?" "Since yesterday." "And the cough?" "A few days." The surgeon nodded thoughtfully. He had seen dozens of similar cases already. Some children recovered, others did not. "I'm afraid there's very little medicine that'll cure such illnesses," he admitted quietly. "I'll leave you a little willow bark to steep in hot water. It may help with the fever. Keep her warm and make certain she drinks whenever she'll take water." Mary's face fell. "That's all?" The surgeon hesitated before answering, "I wish it weren't." He had learned long ago that honesty was kinder than false hope. As the days passed, little Mary Jr.'s appetite disappeared. She refused even the softened oatmeal she had always accepted. Her breathing became faster. Sometimes she shivered despite the warmth of the crowded hold. Other times, sweat soaked through the blanket wrapped around her tiny body. Mary scarcely slept. Each time her daughter stirred, she woke instantly. She cooled the child's forehead with a damp cloth whenever their precious ration of water allowed. Michael quietly gave up part of his own daily allowance so his daughter could drink a little more. He never mentioned it. Mary noticed anyway. Brandon watched everything. He had always admired his father as a man who could fix almost anything. A broken chair, a cracked bucket, a loose wagon wheel. Back in Kerry, people sought Michael's help whenever something needed repairing. Now Brandon saw his father sitting helplessly beside his youngest child. There was nothing to mend, nothing to hammer, nothing to carve. No amount of skill with wood could drive a fever from a little girl's body. For the first time in his life, Brandon realized there were some things even fathers could not fix. Around them, sickness continued to spread. The cramped quarters ensured that everyone breathed the same stale air and lived in constant close contact. A single illness could move rapidly from birth to birth, aided by weakened immune systems caused by hunger, exhaustion, and stress. The passengers still spoke of ship fever, a term commonly used at the time for illnesses that swept through emigrant vessels. Some cases were likely epidemic typhus, spread by body lice. Others may have been influenza, pneumonia, measles, dysentery, or other infectious diseases. Those aboard could rarely distinguish one illness from another. To them, fever was simply fever, and fever often meant death. Late on Wednesday evening, Sean climbed quietly onto the upper deck. He sat beside an elderly sailor, repairing a length of rope. "Is your little sister very sick?" the sailor asked gently. Sean nodded. "Will she die?" The sailor stopped working. He looked out across the ocean before answering. "I've crossed this sea more times than I can count." "Have you seen children get better?" "I have." "And have you seen them not get better?" The old sailor sighed. "I've seen them both." Sean stared silently at the sea. It was not the answer he had wanted. On Friday morning, a cry echoed through the hold, not from Mary's family, from another berth nearby. A young couple had lost their infant during the night. The tiny child had been born only weeks before the voyage began. Her mother refused to let anyone take him from her arms. She rocked him gently for hours, humming the same lullaby she had sung every evening since leaving Ireland. No one interrupted her. Some grief demanded silence. Only when the priest knelt beside her did she finally surrender the little bundle. That afternoon another burial took place at sea, and this time the passengers watched with even greater sadness. An old person had lived a full life. An infant had scarcely begun one. Mary held Mary Jr. so tightly that Brandon wondered if she feared someone might take her too. Saturday brought a small measure of hope. Little Mary Jr.'s fever remained high, but she asked for water. It was the first request she had made in nearly 2 days. Mary smiled through tears as she held the cup to her daughter's lips. The child swallowed only a few mouthfuls before falling asleep again. To anyone else, it would have seemed insignificant. To Mary, it felt like a miracle. The surgeon visited again that afternoon. He smiled faintly after examining the child. "The fever hasn't broken yet," he said, "but she's fighting." Mary closed her eyes in relief. So there's hope. There's always hope. It was a careful answer. He had learned never to promise recovery too soon. As darkness fell on the 28th day at sea, Michael climbed quietly onto the deck alone. The stars above the Atlantic seemed brighter than any he remembered from Ireland. He wondered whether his father, buried beneath the churchyard in County Kerry, had once looked up at these same stars. Below him, 300 frightened emigrants tried to sleep in the foul-smelling darkness. Some dreamed of America, some dreamed of home, some dreamed of neither. Michael folded his rough, work-worn hands, and for several minutes he said nothing. Then, almost reluctantly, he whispered into the night, "I don't know if you're there, but if you are, don't take my little girl." The wind carried his words away across the empty ocean. Whether anyone heard them, he couldn't know. Behind him, deep within the hold, little Mary Jr. slept uneasily beside her mother. Ahead lay 8 more weeks of sea. For the O'Sullivan family, reaching America no longer seemed the greatest challenge. First, they had to survive the voyage.